Sophia Green, a seasoned flight attendant in first class, had mastered the art of perfection. But when a man dressed in worn-out jeans and a simple black jacket boarded her flight, something about him didn't sit right. He didn't belong in the world of billionaires and moguls. As she gave him the cold shoulder, avoiding his requests, she had no idea that this quiet passenger wasn't just another nobody. When the plane landed, she was called to a meeting that would change her life, forever. The man she'd judged, the one she'd treated like an outsider, was the owner of the very airline she worked for. What would happen next would unravel everything she thought she knew about respect, judgment, and success. Stay tuned to see how one moment of arrogance could cost a career and change a life forever. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Sophia Green adjusted the cuffs of her perfectly pressed uniform as she stepped into the luxurious cabin of Skyward Airlines' first-class section. The soft hum of the engines filled the air, and the familiar scent of fresh leather seats surrounded her, grounding her in the moment. She took a slow, deliberate breath, smoothing her hair into place. First-class passengers expected nothing less than perfection, and for years, Sophia had mastered the art of delivering exactly that. Her eyes scanned the empty seats, mentally, preparing herself for the faces she would soon greet. Business moguls, celebrities, and tech billionaires, these were the kinds of people who could make or break a career with a single recommendation. Sophia knew that if she catered to their needs with charm and efficiency, doors within the company would open, and her career would soar. Another day, another opportunity, she murmured to herself as the boarding process began. One by one, passengers trickled in, dressed in designer suits and tailored dresses. Each one greeted her with a nod, a polite smile, and a wave of acknowledgement as they settled into their plush seats. To Sophia, every movement was an opportunity to shine. She greeted each one with practiced warmth, offering them the highest level of service just as she had been trained. Then he arrived. A man in worn-out jeans and a simple black jacket carrying nothing but a backpack stepped into the first-class cabin. He didn't move like the others. There was no air of entitlement, no confident smirk of someone used to privilege. His dark eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, unreadable, distant, and then he silently made his way to seat 2A. Sophia felt a shift in the air, a subtle discomfort creeping into her chest. He didn't belong here. He looked out of place in this sea of wealth and status. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at him as he settled into his seat, his face blank, his movements calm and deliberate. This wasn't the way first-class passengers acted. They were usually fidgeting with their phones, adjusting their expensive sunglasses, or checking their designer watches. Not him. He simply sat there, still, almost as though he was waiting for something. Her brow furrowed slightly as she made her way down the aisle, still keeping her eyes on him. It was unprofessional to linger on a passenger for too long, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling. Was he lost? Did he belong here? "Sir," she called, her tone professional but noticeably colder. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Her voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The man barely reacted. He didn't flinch, didn't offer a smile, just reached into his pocket and handed her his ticket. His eyes never met hers as he handed over the paper, and Sophia's polished nails tapped against it as she scanned it with a practiced eye. First class. No mistake. Still, the unease lingered. She nodded curtly and handed the ticket back to him, but the uncomfortable feeling didn't disappear. Something about this man didn't sit right with her. She felt it deep in her gut, a sense of wrongness she couldn't place. As the flight took off, Sophia settled into her routine. She began serving champagne to the more familiar faces, billionaires, actors, and tech moguls. She flashed bright smiles and exchanged pleasantries with those who were important to her success. But with every glass of champagne she poured, she found herself stealing glances toward seat 2A. Why was he still sitting there so quietly? Most passengers would have made small talk, perhaps asked for something more than a glass of water, but not him. He was the picture of stillness, observing the world around him, but never engaging. Sophia felt a strange tension building in her chest. She moved up and down the aisle, carefully avoiding his row as best she could. She served a well-known venture capitalist with a smile that was softer, her laughter a little more melodic as she made sure he had everything he wanted. She gave him her full attention, playing the role of the perfect flight attendant, just as she was expected to. But each time she passed by 2A, she couldn't ignore the quiet presence of the man sitting there, so calm, so unbothered by the world around him. When it came time to serve him, she couldn't help but feel a sense of reluctance. He had asked for a simple glass of water. It was an easy request, but for some reason it felt like a chore. "Just a moment," she told him, her tone clipped. She made him wait far longer than necessary, hoping the silence between them would feel more comfortable if she could just distance herself. But he didn't respond the way she expected. He didn't raise an eyebrow or sigh in annoyance. Instead, he just nodded silently, his gaze never leaving the window. The silence between them felt heavier now, and Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The other passengers began to notice him too. A woman with pearl earrings shot him a glance, whispering something to her husband. A finance executive cast a judgmental look in his direction, his eyes narrowing. It was subtle, but Sophia could feel the shift in the air, the uncomfortable ripple that spread through the cabin. Feeling emboldened, Sophia approached him once more, her steps deliberate. "Would you mind showing me your ticket again?" she asked, her voice louder than necessary. She made sure others could hear the exchange. For the first time, the man truly looked at her. His dark eyes were calm and unreadable, but there was something piercing about the way he observed her. His gaze felt as though it could cut through her very soul. Without a word, he handed her the ticket again. Sophia scanned it once more, and, before she could say anything, another flight attendant, James, swooped in. "Everything's fine," he said in a low, firm voice. "I already checked his boarding pass. He's where he's supposed to be." The word stung more than Sophia was willing to admit. She had overstepped, and the judgment in James's eyes made her stomach churn. She forced a tight-lipped smile, nodding stiffly. "Of course," she muttered, retreating. As she walked away, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. Subtle, disapproving glances that seemed to follow her every move. She tried to focus on the rest of her duties, but her thoughts kept returning to the man in seat 2A. Who was he really, and why did she feel so uneasy around him? Sophia Green could feel the weight of the air around her, a heaviness that seemed to grow as the flight continued. The soft hum of the plane's engines couldn't mask the growing discomfort she felt every time she passed by seat 2A. It was almost as though the man sitting there was a shadow in her mind, a presence that seemed to stretch far beyond his quiet demeanor. His stillness was unsettling, and as much as she tried to ignore it, the feeling remained. She had worked in this environment long enough to know when something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her finger on why this man made her feel so uneasy. As the flight continued its smooth course, passengers settled into their usual activities. Some were working on their laptops, others were catching up on movies, while a few were deep in conversation with one another. The champagne flowed freely, and Sophia made her rounds, flashing bright smiles and greeting familiar faces. But no matter how many times she passed by, her eyes always seemed to wander back to him. He hadn't spoken a word since their last exchange, and yet Sophia couldn't stop thinking about him. Why hadn't he reacted to her coldness? Most passengers, in his situation, would have at least offered a look of frustration, or perhaps even a polite but pointed remark. But he hadn't. He just sat there staring out of the window, a picture of calm that contrasted with the rest of the cabin. It was as though he was in a world of his own, unaffected by the small drama unfolding around him. And yet, the more Sophia observed him, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her too. Not with hostility or resentment, but with something deeper, something that made her feel as though he saw through her, into the very core of who she was. Her thoughts were interrupted when she caught a glimpse of two of her fellow flight attendants, Lila and Ben, whispering as they passed by the back of the cabin. Their eyes darted toward seat 2A, and then they exchanged knowing looks. Sophia felt a twinge of irritation. Why were they talking about him? Did they feel the same unease she did? Or were they judging him the way she had based on his appearance? She shook off the thought and continued on with her duties. But as she moved through the aisles, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. A woman seated near the front, dressed in an elegant gown and sparkling jewelry, cast a lingering glance toward 2A. She whispered something to her husband, who raised an eyebrow before returning to his meal. Sophia couldn't hear the words, but the look they exchanged was enough to tell her they were talking about the man in seat 2A. It wasn't the first time she had seen such behavior among the elite passengers. The unspoken judgment was all too familiar. At first, Sophia dismissed it, telling herself that it was just the usual elitism. But as the flight went on, she noticed the whispers were becoming more frequent. The woman with the pearl earrings glanced at him again, this time exchanging an obvious judgmental look with the man sitting next to her. Even a businessman in a crisp suit and tie couldn't seem to hide his disapproval, subtly muttering to his seatmate as he looked in the man's direction. Sophia felt a gnawing sense of discomfort growing in her chest. She knew this kind of behavior. It was what she had been trained to identify, the underlying tension that simmered in the cabin, the subtle exchanges of glances and whispered comments that signaled who belonged and who didn't. And despite the fact that she had been raised to never judge a book by its cover, Sophia couldn't help but wonder why this man didn't fit the mold. It wasn't just the way he looked, his simple clothes, his lack of ostentation, but it was the way he carried himself. He wasn't making small talk with anyone, wasn't trying to impress anyone, and certainly wasn't taking advantage of the privileges of first class. In fact, he seemed indifferent to the luxury around him, a trait that Sophia found both baffling and somewhat threatening. Her attention was interrupted by a sudden request. A well-known venture capitalist in the front row raised his hand, asking for more champagne. Sophia quickly made her way over, her thoughts momentarily distracted by the request. She poured his drink with a practiced smile, engaging in light conversation about the stock market as she always did. The man had been a regular on Skyward Airlines flights, and Sophia knew that making him feel important was key to maintaining her position in the company. But as she returned to the galley to retrieve another bottle of champagne, her thoughts returned to the man in 2A. She couldn't help herself. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he reacted to the subtle disapproval of the other passengers? Most people would have sensed the hostility by now, especially in such an environment. Sophia tried to focus on her work, but every time she passed 2A, her gaze would dart back to him. He remained unchanged, still, silent, his eyes fixed on the window as though the world outside held more interest than the one inside the cabin. It was during one of these moments, as she refilled a glass for a customer, that Sophia saw something that caught her off guard. The man in 2A turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with her. It was brief, but in that moment, something shifted. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger, just calm, almost as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. And then, without a word, he returned to staring out the window. The encounter left her rattled. Why did he look at her like that? It wasn't like the others. He didn't look at her with the subtle disdain that she had come to expect from first-class passengers. No, his gaze was different, almost knowing. Sophia shook her head, trying to rid herself of the unsettling feeling that was starting to creep up her spine. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let her discomfort with one passenger distract her. But try as she might, she couldn't stop thinking about the man in 2A. There was something about him, something that didn't fit, and that was exactly what bothered her the most. As the flight progressed, the hum of the engines began to feel less like a comforting lull and more like a constant reminder of the turbulence brewing within her. She couldn't escape it, not the man in seat 2A, not the uncomfortable silence, and certainly not the growing sense of unease that seemed to grip her heart. The flight continued, but for Sophia, the journey had already taken a different turn. one she hadn't seen coming. As the hours stretched on, the flight seemed to take on a rhythm of its own, a kind of quiet perfection that was both comforting and unnerving. The smooth hum of the engines, the soft chatter of the elite passengers, the clink of glass as champagne was served, it was all so familiar to Sophia. She had spent years perfecting this routine, blending in seamlessly with the world of luxury that she had come to know so well. But now, with every passing minute, something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope, teetering between professionalism and something deeper, something that had to do with the man in seat 2A. He hadn't said a word since the last interaction, and neither had she. But it wasn't just the silence that unsettled her. It was the weight of the unspoken, the subtle but undeniable tension that had begun to cloud the cabin. She was an expert at reading people, and she could feel the undercurrent of judgment that rippled through the air, like a low murmur of disapproval. It was the way people looked at him, the way their eyes narrowed as they stole glances at his simple clothing, at his quiet demeanor. They were trying to place him, to figure out why someone like him was in their midst. Sophia had worked in first class long enough to recognize when people didn't belong. She had learned to spot the markers, the subtle signs of discomfort, the way a person held themselves, the little cues that told her if someone was out of their element. And yet she couldn't figure him out. Victor Lee, as his boarding pass had said, was a complete enigma. He didn't fit the mold, and that was exactly what bothered her. As she moved through the aisles, offering drinks and serving meals, she noticed more of the same. Whispers, judging glances, the kind of quiet disapproval that only existed in the rarefied air of first class. The businessman near the front, who had initially shot Victor a disapproving look, now seemed to be muttering under his breath to his companion. Sophia didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. She could feel the judgment in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was suffocating. She passed by seat 2A again, her gaze flicking to him despite her best efforts to stay focused on the other passengers. He was still there, sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the window as if the outside world held more allure than the one inside the plane. He had become a fixture in her thoughts, an image that she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried, and that only made her more uneasy. Sophia's thoughts were interrupted when she caught sight of a familiar face. It was James, another flight attendant, standing near the galley speaking quietly to a few of the passengers. Sophia had worked with James many times before, and while they were never particularly close, they always had a mutual respect for one another. But now, as she made her way over to him, she noticed something different in his demeanor. He was standing, a little too still, his eyes flicking nervously toward the back of the plane to seat 2A. James wasn't the type to get rattled, so this behavior was unusual. "James?" she said, approaching him with a casual smile. "Is everything all right?" He turned toward her, but there was something in his expression that Sophia couldn't quite read. He hesitated before speaking, his voice lowered. "I don't know, Soph. There's just something about that guy. The one in 2A. Sophia's stomach tightened at the mention of the man's seat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound casual. James shook his head, glancing over his shoulder as if he didn't want anyone else to overhear. "I don't know. Just the way he's been acting. He's not like the others. I've never seen a passenger so calm. No complaints, no requests. It's strange." Sophia frowned, her mind racing. She hadn't considered that anyone else might feel the same unease she did. "What exactly are you trying to say, James?" "I'm just saying it's odd. He's not reacting to anything, not to the luxury around him, not to the attention we're giving to other passengers. It's like he's invisible." Sophia didn't respond immediately. She had felt the same way, but hearing James put it into words made it sound even more unsettling. She glanced back at seat 2A. Victor was still sitting there, staring out of the window, completely unaffected by the luxury surrounding him. The silence between her and James stretched for a moment before he spoke again, his voice Lower this time. You haven't asked him about his ticket again, have you? Sophia stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. No, she replied quickly. I haven't. James gave her a long look. Just be careful, Soph. There's something about him. I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. The warning hung in the air, and for the first time Sophia felt the full weight of the situation. She had been so focused on maintaining the perfect image of first-class service that she had overlooked something far more important, the human element. Victor was a person, not a problem to be solved. She had treated him as an inconvenience, an anomaly, someone who didn't belong. But now, with James's words echoing in her mind, Sophia realized how deeply she had judged him. Her unease grew as the flight wore on. The whispers among the passengers became more frequent, more pronounced. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were all watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to prove that he wasn't supposed to be here. But still Victor remained silent, still as a statue, his eyes fixed on the clouds outside the window. Sophia couldn't take it anymore. She needed to know more about him. But what was she supposed to ask? What was she supposed to say? She had already made a fool of herself, questioning his presence in first class, and now she was afraid that asking anything more would only make things worse. It was then that she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. One of the passengers, a well-dressed woman with a sharp gaze, leaned over to the businessman who had been staring at Victor earlier. Sophia couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the woman's pointed finger move toward Victor, her lips forming words that were clearly critical. The businessman nodded, his expression hardening. It was clear now. The judgment was spreading. And Sophia knew that she was a part of it. She had been part of the system that categorized people based on appearances, based on the social hierarchies that dictated who belonged and who didn't. But what if she had been wrong? The question lingered in her mind as she moved through the cabin, her professional smile firmly in place. The more she thought about it, the more the weight of her own actions pressed down on her. What if the real turbulence wasn't just the flight, but the way she had treated Victor, and by extension everyone who didn't fit the mold of what she thought was acceptable? As the flight continued, Sophia found herself at a crossroads. Would she continue to uphold the facade of perfection? Or would she begin to see the passengers as people, not labels? The answer was starting to become clear, but she wasn't ready to face it yet. As the flight began its descent, Sophia felt the air in the cabin shift once again. It wasn't the usual anticipation that accompanied the end of a long flight. This time, there was something heavier, something more profound. In the atmosphere, the engine's hum was drowned out by the constant buzz of her thoughts, a whirlwind of self-doubt and reflection that she couldn't shake. For the first time in years, she wasn't focused on the tasks at hand or the service she needed to provide. Instead, all she could think about was Victor Lee and the uncomfortable realization that her carefully constructed world of status and perfection might be flawed. The turbulence, both literal and emotional, seemed to have a lasting effect on Sophia. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, analyzing everything she had done, the coldness she had shown Victor, the discomfort she had projected, and the quiet judgment that had simmered beneath the surface. She had always prided herself on being an expert in customer service, on knowing exactly how to read people and make them feel special. But what if she had been wrong all along? What if the real lesson wasn't about catering to the elite, but about treating everyone with the same level of respect no matter their background? Sophia tried to push these thoughts aside as the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let her personal turmoil affect her professionalism. But as the seatbelt signs flickered off and passengers began to gather their belongings, she saw something that made her freeze in place. There, standing near the front of the cabin, was James, talking quietly with two men in sharp suits. Their faces were serious, and there was an undeniable tension in the air. Sophia moved toward them, her heart racing. She had seen security personnel enter the first-class cabin only once before, and it was always a sign that something serious was happening. The men's eyes flicked toward her as she approached, and she could feel their gaze land heavily on her. One of the men handed James a folded note, and she saw his expression pale as he unfolded it. Sophia's stomach dropped. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice came out strained. James glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. He handed the note to her wordlessly, and as Sophia unfolded it, her eyes skimmed over the words. Upon landing in Los Angeles, Sophia Green is to report immediately to the executive office of Skyward Airlines for a mandatory meeting. Her heart pounded as she stared at the note, her mind racing with questions. A mandatory meeting with the executives? That could only mean one thing. This wasn't just a routine debriefing. This was something serious. She felt the weight of the note in her hands, but her mind was already in overdrive. Had her behavior on the flight been so bad that she was now being summoned by corporate? She thought back to the way she had treated Victor, the man she had assumed didn't belong in first class. What had she done? Could this be the consequence of her arrogance, her judgment? The feeling of dread in her chest grew heavier with every step as she made her way to the airport terminal, the note still clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that her career, her reputation, was about to be put under a microscope. What if they decided she wasn't fit to work for Skyward Airlines anymore? What if this was the end of her career? Sophia tried to steady her breathing as she walked through the polished corridors of LAX. The hum of airport life seemed distant, muffled, as if she were in a different world entirely. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet, and each click of her heels felt like a drumbeat in her chest. Her thoughts kept returning to Victor, to the way she had dismissed him without knowing anything about him. What if this was her moment to learn something deeper, something beyond the surface? As she reached the glass doors of the Skyward Airlines executive office, she hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before pushing them open. Inside, the air was crisp and sterile, almost too clean. The receptionist barely looked up as she entered, nodding toward a conference room down the hall. "They're waiting for you," the receptionist said, her voice flat and professional. Sophia swallowed hard and nodded, walking toward the room with a sense of dread settling deeper in her gut. She had no idea what to expect. The glass doors to the conference room loomed ahead, and with every step her anxiety grew. When she entered the room, the first thing she saw was the large silver emblem of Skyward Airlines on the wall, gleaming with cold authority. The second thing she saw was him, Victor Lee. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of him sitting at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but commanding. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that seemed to effortlessly exude power and authority. Next to him was the senior operations director, Henry Wallace, and the head of customer relations, Margaret Cho, along with two other executives she barely recognized. But it wasn't them who captured her attention. It was Victor. The man she had judged, the man she had treated like an outsider, was now sitting in front of her with an air of effortless authority. She froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had expected to face the usual corporate reprimand, the stern looks of disapproval. But this was different. Victor didn't look at her with anger or frustration. He looked at her as if he were waiting for something that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Henry cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Please, have a seat, Ms. Green." Sophia's legs felt like jelly as she lowered herself into the chair across from Victor. She could feel the eyes of the executives on her, but it was Victor's gaze that made her stomach churn. He was watching her closely, almost as if he were trying to figure her out, just as she had tried to figure him out. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and Sophia could feel the sweat building on her palms. She opened her mouth to speak, but Victor beat her to it. "Let's talk about standards," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, but there was a sharpness to it that made her pulse race. "What do you think qualifies someone for respect, Ms. Green?" The question hit her like a slap, and she froze, unsure of how to respond. She had always thought that respect was earned by meeting certain expectations, by fitting in with the right crowd, by serving the elite, by maintaining the illusion of perfection. But now, faced with this question, she wasn't so sure. I respect all passengers, she said quickly, but her voice wavered. I always strive to offer the best service. Victor leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Do you? Or do you just serve the people you deem worthy of it? Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this line of questioning, but deep down she knew he was right. She had treated people differently based on who they were, based on their status. And she had treated Victor like an outsider, because he didn't fit into the mold she had so carefully constructed. Why do you think I fly under a different name? Victor asked, his voice softer now. Sophia shook her head, confused. Because I want to see how my employees behave when they think no one is watching, he said, his voice steady and calm. Some pass the test and some don't. The words hung in the air and Sophia's chest tightened. This wasn't just about her job, it was about something deeper, something she had been avoiding for a long time. She had judged Victor, but in doing so she had judged herself. Margaret Cho spoke up next, her tone measured. Your record shows that you're efficient, professional, and well-trained, but there's also a pattern. Several complaints have been filed regarding your treatment of passengers who don't meet a certain expectation. Sophia's stomach twisted. She had never seen herself as someone who judged others. She had always believed she was just doing her job. But now, as the words sank in, she realized the truth. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, she blurted out, but the words felt hollow. Victor raised a hand, silencing her. You looked at me when I boarded, and I could see it in your eyes. You assumed I didn't belong here. The silence in the room stretched, and Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She had judged him without even realizing it, and now she was faced with the consequences of her actions. After what felt like an eternity, Victor leaned back in his chair. You're not fired, he said, his voice calm. But you won't be working first class for a while. You'll be going through a new training program, one that focuses not just on service but on empathy. Sophia nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. She had been given a second chance, but it wasn't just about her career, it was about who she was. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she liked the answer.